How you feeling if the only way to make it out of life, someone will want to use you or take advantage of you? Emily Dawson had spent the last 7 years scrubbing floors, wiping counters, and picking up after people who didn't give her a second thought. A janitor in a high-rise building in the heart of Manhattan, Emily's life was nothing more than cleaning up the mess others left behind. She didn't mind it, or at least, she had learned to live with it. The days blurred together, early mornings, long hours, and nights spent alone in a small apartment. But tonight, everything was about to change. As Emily entered the grand hall, she felt the cool rush of air conditioning against her skin and the weight of her own breath. The marble floors gleamed under the crystal chandeliers that hung like stars in the evening sky. This wasn't just any building. It was the kind of place she had only seen in movies, places where wealth oozed from every corner, and the air was thick with perfume and power. She had never been to an event like this before. In fact, she wasn't even sure why she was there. It started with a strange invitation, a residence visa, an offer she couldn't refuse. The message had arrived in an envelope sealed with gold, telling her she was wanted at an exclusive gala thrown by none other than Richard Cole, one of the wealthiest men in America. A janitor. At a billionaire's gala. She glanced around, trying to blend in, but her cheap dress and worn shoes didn't fit with the high-end tuxedos and sparkling gowns. She felt small, insignificant, and out of place. The laughter around her was polite, but it echoed in her mind, louder than the music. She wasn't supposed to be here. But Richard Cole had chosen her, and she didn't know why. The man himself stood near the podium, delivering a speech that everyone seemed to hang on to. His voice was smooth, measured, and controlled. He was tall, taller than most men, and exuded an air of command that drew attention the moment he stepped into a room. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his jaw square, and his suit, well, it looked like it cost more than she made in a year. Emily stood frozen, watching him as he spoke. She wasn't the only one captivated by his presence. The entire room seemed to be hanging on his every word. As he raised his glass, his eyes scanned the crowd, until they landed on her. For a moment, everything stopped. She felt the weight of his gaze as if it were physical, pulling her in. She quickly looked down at her shoes, hoping he hadn't noticed her. But he had. His gaze lingered just long enough for her heart to skip a beat. Without warning, he started walking toward her, cutting through the crowd like a shark. The chatter faded, and the room seemed to shrink around them. "Emily Dawson," he said as he reached her, his voice calm but commanding. "I've been watching you." She blinked, her pulse racing. How did he know her name? "I don't understand," she stammered, unsure what was happening. He smiled, a smile that sent a chill down her spine. "I've been watching your work," he said, his eyes gleaming with something she couldn't quite place. "You have a certain strength. A resilience that most people would overlook." Emily's mouth went dry. "I'm just a janitor, Mr. Cole." "No," he said, his gaze never leaving hers, "you're much more than that." He paused, his eyes flicking to the crowd behind her before returning to her with a quiet intensity. "You're here because you matter, Emily. You just don't know it yet." Before she could react, he stepped closer, his voice low, the kind of voice that felt like a secret being shared. "What if I told you I could give you everything you've ever wanted? A life of luxury. Security. Money, more than you could spend in a lifetime. All I ask in return is something simple." Emily's breath caught in her throat. She had no idea what he was about to say next, but she had an inkling it wouldn't be good. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard's smile widened. "I want you to carry my child," he said, as if it was the most normal thing in the world. "That's all. In return, I'll grant you a residence visa, a life you could only dream of, and all the resources you need. You'll be taken care of." Emily's head spun. This had to be a joke, right? This couldn't be real. But the look in his eyes told her otherwise. He was serious. For a long moment, Emily couldn't speak. Her mind raced, but she couldn't find a way out. She hadn't expected this. The offer was too far-fetched, too outrageous. She opened her mouth to say something, but the words caught in her throat. "Think about it, Emily," Richard said softly, almost coaxingly. "Everything you've ever wanted can be yours. Just say yes, and it's yours." The music continued to play around them, but Emily felt as though she were underwater, unable to breathe. She had no idea how to respond, no idea what to make of this insane offer. Richard Cole, a man who could buy anything and anyone, was offering her a chance to change her life forever. But there was something unsettling about the way he spoke. It wasn't just about money. It wasn't just about power. It was something else. Something darker. As Richard walked away, his final words hung in the air, lingering like a promise she wasn't sure she wanted to keep. "You'll regret it if you don't take this opportunity, Emily." Emily stood in the corner of the ballroom, trying to collect her thoughts. The room, once full of glitz and glamour, now seemed like a prison, each face a mask hiding a secret, a purpose she couldn't quite decipher. She was out of place. She didn't belong here, and she wasn't sure what to make of Richard's offer. The words kept echoing in her mind, "Carry my child, and everything you've ever wanted will be yours." Her stomach churned. It wasn't just a business deal, it felt more like an ultimatum. But Richard didn't care about the child, she realized. He cared about his empire, his legacy. And she was just another pawn in his game. Emily had grown up with nothing. Her mother, a waitress, had struggled to keep food on the table. Her father had disappeared when she was just a child. Rumors about his death had circulated, but Emily never really knew the truth. She was raised by her mother, who worked herself to the bone, only to end up in a hospital bed, too worn out to fight anymore. Emily had vowed never to let herself fall into that same cycle of poverty and struggle. But Richard's offer? It felt like a trap. She could already imagine the life she'd have if she accepted. The mansion. The clothes. The money. But it came with a price, one she wasn't sure she could pay. Richard had already made it clear, this wasn't about love. This wasn't about family. It was about control. As the evening wore on, Emily's thoughts spiraled. She tried to push the idea out of her head, but it kept coming back. Richard Cole wasn't just a businessman. He was a manipulator, a man who had everything and still wanted more. What if it wasn't just about her? What if this was part of a larger game? A plan to ensure his family's legacy, to secure power in ways only a man like him could. Her hands shook as she took a glass of wine from a passing waiter, though she had no intention of drinking it. She stared into the reflection in the glass, wondering how she had gotten here, and more importantly, what would happen if she didn't say yes. Emily. She turned to find Vanessa Williams standing before her, Richard's fiancée. Her smile was tight, her eyes hard. "Careful," Vanessa said, her voice dripping with venom. "Richard doesn't like to be kept waiting." The weeks dragged on, each day a blurred repetition of the last. Emily awoke in a room that belonged to someone else, in a mansion that might as well have been a prison. Richard's world was beautiful but cold, each corner meticulously curated to show power and wealth. Yet, despite the plush surroundings, Emily couldn't shake the nagging feeling that she didn't belong. Richard had made it clear that she was there for a reason. She had accepted his offer, albeit reluctantly, but the more time she spent in his world, the more she realized the price was heavier than she had anticipated. Richard's coldness haunted her. He wasn't warm or affectionate, not in the way she'd imagined a relationship should be. He was distant, calculating, emotionally absent. It was as though she were nothing more than a piece in a much larger game. She tried to push back, to find some part of the man she had once seen in the grand ballroom, but every attempt fell short. He never truly looked at her as an equal. He didn't want love. He didn't even seem to care about the child growing inside her. It was all about control, about securing his empire. The baby wasn't a sign of affection, it was a tool. One afternoon, as Emily walked through the mansion, her eyes wandered over the photographs hanging on the walls, pictures of Richard with powerful people, dignitaries, and celebrities. But as her gaze settled on one particularly large portrait of a family, something caught her attention. There, in the background of the photo, was a familiar face, a man she had never forgotten. Her father. Her breath caught in her throat, the world spinning as her heart raced. She hadn't known for sure if Richard had ever crossed paths with her father, but seeing his face in that photo made the connection undeniable. Richard had been in her father's world. And her father? He had died under mysterious circumstances when Emily was just a little girl. The years of unanswered questions, the rumors of betrayal, deceit, and unfinished business, came crashing down on her all at once. This was no coincidence. Richard's world was connected to hers in a way she couldn't ignore. She had to know more. That evening, when Richard arrived at the mansion, he found Emily sitting at the grand dining table, her eyes cold and calculating. The tension in the room was palpable as he slowly approached. "Emily," he said softly, his voice still carrying the air of command, "is something wrong?" Emily didn't respond at first. She simply stared at him, her gaze unblinking. There was a coolness in her eyes now, one he hadn't seen before. "I know who you are," she said, her voice quiet, but firm. "I know what you did." Richard's face stiffened for just a moment before he regained his composure, his smile returning like a practiced mask. "What do you mean, Emily?" "Don't play games," she spat, her voice rising. "I saw the photo. My father's face is in that picture. You knew him." Richard took a step back, as if the ground beneath him had shifted. His expression darkened. For a brief second, there was a flicker of something. Fear? Regret? It was gone too quickly to be sure. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he said, his tone cold, defensive. But Emily wasn't buying it. She had seen through his facade long enough to know that something deeper lay beneath. "I know he was involved in your business. And I know what happened to him," she pressed, her voice sharp. Richard didn't answer right away, and in that silence, Emily realized something crucial. Richard wasn't just a man who built his wealth on business acumen. He had built it on lies, betrayal, and the quiet destruction of anyone who got too close. Her father had been part of the price Richard had paid to climb to the top. "You've been using me this entire time," Emily said, her voice cracking with anger. "This isn't about the baby. This is about your legacy. You didn't want love, you wanted a pawn." Richard's jaw tightened. For a moment, there was a flicker of hesitation, but it disappeared as quickly as it came. "I did what I had to do," he said, his voice low, almost too calm. "You're here because I chose you. I could have chosen anyone, but I didn't." Her fists clenched, her body trembling with the weight of the truth she was starting to piece together. "And now, you expect me to just accept this?" Richard didn't reply. Instead, he turned his back on her and walked toward the door. But before he left, he spoke one final time, his words sharp and cold. "You'll never understand. But you will. Eventually." The days that followed felt like they were moving at a pace Emily couldn't keep up with. The world she'd stepped into wasn't real. It was a dream wrapped in luxury, a fairy tale that had a dark, twisted ending. Richard kept his distance, but Emily knew now that he was playing a game. A game with pieces that could be sacrificed for the sake of his empire. She couldn't trust him. Not anymore. And yet, she couldn't turn away either. Not when the truth was just out of reach. Not when the lies he had woven into the fabric of her life were beginning to unravel. Her investigation into Richard's business dealings started small, just a few inquiries into the companies he ran, some research into old financial records. But it didn't take long before the walls closed in on her. Security became tighter around her movements, and Richard's demeanor grew colder. His smiles were always calculated, his touch always impersonal. The connection between them remained an illusion. But the truth she was seeking had to be buried deep within his empire. Emily began to see just how far Richard would go to keep his world intact. Late one night, as Emily sifted through piles of old papers in Richard's private study, she stumbled upon something that made her blood run cold. It was a series of letters between Richard and her father. The words jumped out at her, confirming everything she had suspected. Her father had been trying to expose Richard's shady dealings, his hidden wealth built on corruption and exploitation. The letters were filled with vague references to meetings in dark corners of offices, to deals that shouldn't have been made, to money that had changed hands in ways that were never meant to be seen. And then Emily found it, a final letter, one that was written just days before her father's death. It was a plea, a desperate call for help, a warning that Richard was involved in something far darker than anyone had realized. But it was too late. Her father had been silenced. And now, Emily was the next pawn in Richard's game. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. Richard hadn't just used her to create a family. He had used her to bury his past, to ensure his secrets stayed hidden. Emily was part of something much larger, something that went far beyond just wealth and power. She was part of a conspiracy, a cover-up that could cost her everything. Emily's investigation had only just begun, but already the walls of Richard's empire were crumbling before her eyes. She'd uncovered more than she ever expected: financial records, secret meetings, hidden assets, all pointing to one dark truth: Richard had built his empire on lies and broken promises. Yet there was one thing that didn't add up. Richard wasn't acting like someone with nothing to lose. He wasn't worried, even though Emily was clearly digging into his past. Instead, he seemed calm, as though everything was still under his control. It was the subtle manipulation that scared her. Each move he made seemed calculated. Each gesture was part of a larger plan that Emily couldn't quite piece together. She was just a small part of his intricate chessboard, but she was beginning to see the game for what it really was. One evening, she found herself in the lavish sitting room, looking out over the sprawling garden below. The view from Richard's mansion was breathtaking, a picturesque escape from the world of power struggles and deceit. It was a moment of peace, a fleeting one, but peace nonetheless. And yet, even here in the calm, there was no escape. She could feel Richard's presence even when he wasn't around. He had a way of making his control seem invisible, seeping into every corner of her life. But now, she couldn't ignore it any longer. She had to act. The phone call came late that night. "Emily," Richard's voice crackled through the receiver, smooth as ever, "I need to see you." Her heart skipped a beat. The calmness of his tone didn't match the urgency of his words. But there was no turning back now. She dressed quickly, her fingers trembling as she fastened her coat. Each second felt like an eternity as she walked toward the elevator. The night had settled in around her, and the mansion seemed eerily quiet. The hum of the air conditioning, the distant echoes of voices in the halls, it was all part of the strange, surreal world she had entered. When she arrived at Richard's office, he was standing by the window, looking out at the city skyline. He didn't turn when she entered, but his presence filled the room. His back was straight, his posture commanding as always. There was a momentary pause before he spoke. "You're looking into things you shouldn't be, Emily," he said, his voice colder than before. "I can't have you stirring up trouble." Emily didn't flinch. "I'm not going to stop. You've lied to me, lied to everyone around you." Richard turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. For a moment, his expression faltered, just a brief flicker of doubt, but it was gone as quickly as it came. His gaze hardened, the walls of his empire solidifying in an instant. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," he said, his voice now low, almost dangerous. "This world, my world, has rules. You've seen too much. And people who see too much don't stay around for long." Emily swallowed hard. The threat was real, and she could feel it pressing down on her chest. But she wasn't afraid anymore. Not of him. Not of his power. "I'm not your pawn anymore, Richard," she said firmly, taking a step closer. "I'm not going to be part of your game." Richard's lips curled into a faint smile. "You think you have a choice?" There was something in the way he said it, something that made her blood run cold. He was toying with her, like she was just another problem to solve. She wasn't part of the plan anymore, she had become an obstacle. And in his world, obstacles didn't exist for long. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a manila folder, tossing it onto the desk in front of her. "You want answers? Here they are," he said, his voice almost mocking. Emily opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside were more papers, contracts, bank transfers, business deals. But as she flipped through them, one name jumped out at her, her father's name. Her breath caught in her throat. There, written in black ink, was her father's signature, on a deal she had never known about. It was a business transaction between her father and Richard Cole's company. A deal that looked perfectly legitimate on the surface, but Emily knew better now. Her father had been involved in something far more sinister than just business. This was the final piece of the puzzle. "This is how you built your empire," Emily whispered, her voice shaking. "Through people like my father. You used them." Richard's gaze darkened. He stood up and walked slowly toward her. "You think this is about your father?" His words were like ice. "This is about survival. About power. Your father wasn't part of some grand conspiracy. He was a means to an end. Just like you." Emily stood still, her chest tight. The truth was too much to take in, but it didn't matter anymore. Richard's manipulation, his lies, it all came flooding to the surface. But just as she was about to speak, the door slammed open. "Richard." Vanessa's voice cut through the tension like a blade. She stormed into the room, her face flushed with anger. "What is this? What's going on?" Richard's eyes flicked toward her, but he didn't move. Vanessa's anger was palpable. "I've had enough of this charade. You need to stop playing with her. Emily watched as Richard's expression flickered for a moment, something behind his eyes that she hadn't seen before. Guilt? Regret? He quickly composed himself and turned to face Vanessa. This is none of your concern, he said coldly, his voice now firm and commanding. You've done your part. But Emily could see the cracks in his armor. For the first time, he wasn't in complete control. Vanessa turned on Emily, her eyes narrowing. You're playing a dangerous game, girl, she spat. You have no idea who you're up against. But Emily wasn't listening. She had seen enough. It was time to finish this. She turned to Richard one last time. I'm done, she said, her voice steady. You'll never control me again. And with that, she left the office, leaving the two of them behind, locked in their own web of lies and manipulation. The night was quiet, unnervingly so. As Emily walked through the sprawling halls of Richard's mansion, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every sound, every movement, felt amplified in the emptiness of the mansion's cold, opulent corridors. She had no idea where Richard or Vanessa were, but it didn't matter anymore. Emily had made up her mind. She couldn't stay in his world any longer, not after everything she had uncovered. But just as she was about to turn the corner and leave, a figure stepped into her path. It was Richard. You're running away, aren't you? His voice was low, but it carried a weight that made her stop in her tracks. I'm not running, Emily said, standing her ground. I'm done being your pawn. You've used me, you've lied to me, and now you're going to pay for it. Richard's eyes flicked over her, his expression unreadable. You think I'm the one who's going to pay? You think you're the first person to challenge me? He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming her once again. You have no idea who you're dealing with. Emily's pulse quickened. She'd never felt this defiant in her life, but there was something about Richard's words that struck a chord. He had always thought of himself as untouchable, invincible. But tonight, he wasn't in control anymore. She was. What I know is that you've been using people your entire life, Emily shot back, her voice steady, though her heart pounded in her chest. You've used my father, and now you're using me. I'm not going to let you destroy everything I have left. Richard smirked, his face hardening. You don't even know what you're walking into. There's no escaping me, Emily. You'll never be free. The fear crept back into Emily's veins, but she pushed it aside. She had to be strong. For herself. For her son. Richard had already taken so much from her, he wouldn't take any more. Why? She asked, the word barely a whisper. Why did you do it? Why my father? Richard's smile faded, and for a moment, Emily saw something close to vulnerability flicker behind his eyes. But it disappeared just as quickly. It was never personal, he said, his voice colder now, the ice returning. Your father was a means to an end. He was part of a deal that got me where I am today. There are things in this world, things you don't understand, that you have to do to survive. Emily's hands clenched into fists. I understand enough, she said. And I'm not going to let you destroy me the way you destroyed him. There was a long pause as Richard's gaze bored into hers. Then, without warning, he spoke again, his voice softer this time, almost pleading. You think you're the first person to try and take me down? You think you're the first person to try and break free? His eyes darkened, and he stepped even closer, lowering his voice. I built this empire from nothing. No one will ever take it from me, not even you. His words were a threat, but they were also a warning. Emily could see the desperation beneath his calm exterior. Richard wasn't just a man who liked control. He was terrified of losing it. I'm not trying to take anything from you, Richard, Emily said, her voice strong, cutting through the tension in the room. I'm taking back what's mine. Richard's face tightened in anger, his jaw clenching. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, the door behind him flew open. Richard. Vanessa's voice rang through the room, sharp and demanding. What's going on here? Richard turned to face her, his expression hardening once again. This is none of your business, Vanessa. Emily could see the jealousy in Vanessa's eyes as she stormed into the room. She had always known Vanessa didn't trust her, but tonight, that distrust seemed to have boiled over into something more dangerous. You've made a mistake, Vanessa said, her tone dripping with disdain. You think you can just walk away from all of this? You think you can threaten Richard and get away with it? Emily stood her ground, refusing to back down. I'm not afraid of you, she said, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. And I'm not afraid of him either. Vanessa laughed bitterly. You should be, she said, her eyes narrowing. Because you're going to regret this. The tension in the room was thick, suffocating. Emily could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but she refused to let fear control her anymore. Richard and Vanessa stood together, their united front making Emily feel even more isolated, but in that isolation, she found clarity. This was her fight. And she wasn't going to let them win. You don't get to control me anymore, Emily said, her voice firm. You don't get to control my life, my choices, or my son. This ends now. Vanessa's lips curled into a cruel smile. We'll see about that, she said, stepping closer. But Emily was already stepping away, her mind focused on the one thing that mattered. She had one last card to play. With a final glance at Richard and Vanessa, Emily turned and walked out of the room, her heart racing with the knowledge that everything was about to change. The final gamble had begun. Emily stood in front of the mansion's grand windows, watching the storm clouds gather in the sky. The distant rumble of thunder mirrored the growing chaos inside her mind. Every step she took toward exposing Richard's empire felt like a step into unknown territory. The pieces of the puzzle were coming together, but she knew this final move would be the most dangerous yet. The last few days had been a whirlwind of uncertainty, filled with moments where Emily questioned everything she thought she knew. But now, standing in Richard's world, surrounded by luxury that had never been hers, she had a single goal in mind: to take back control. Richard's calm demeanor, his perfectly crafted public image, was all part of the mask he wore. Beneath it, Emily knew there was something darker, something she had seen glimpses of. She'd been right all along. This wasn't just about a baby. This was about legacy. And Richard's legacy depended on keeping everyone around him in line, using manipulation as a means to get what he wanted. But the truth was coming out. Slowly, but surely. Earlier that day, Emily had made a crucial discovery. Richard's most trusted advisor had left behind a trail of evidence, links to fraudulent deals, hidden offshore accounts, and shady transactions that led back to Richard's earliest days in the business world. If exposed, it would bring down everything he had spent his life building. She knew the path ahead was dangerous. Richard wouldn't give up his empire without a fight. And Vanessa? Emily wasn't sure whose side she was on anymore, but she had a sinking feeling that Vanessa's loyalty to Richard was as precarious as a house of cards. Emily had to act before it was too late. She had to confront Richard, but she couldn't do it alone. The tension between them had escalated to a point where everything was hanging by a thread. She needed something more, something that would give her leverage, something that could break his hold on her life once and for all. That night, Richard came home late, his presence cutting through the silence like a sharp knife. Emily was waiting for him in the grand study, the room where they had so often held their most intense conversations. His eyes flicked over her, his expression unreadable. He knew she was upset, but he didn't seem to care. You've been busy, haven't you? He said coolly, stepping into the room and standing in front of her. His eyes searched hers, looking for something. I don't appreciate you digging into things that aren't your concern. Emily didn't flinch. She was tired of being afraid. Tired of being manipulated. She'd spent too long playing his game. You lied to me, Richard, she said, her voice steady. You used me. You used my family to get ahead, and now I'm done being part of your scheme. Richard's smile faltered for a moment. He had expected her to back down, to crumble under the weight of his control. But Emily was different now. She had uncovered the truth, and there was no turning back. This is about more than just you and me, Emily, Richard said, his voice low, almost coaxing. It always has been. You're not just a part of my plan, you're the key to it. Emily stepped closer, her heart pounding. Your plan. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. Your plan is built on lies, Richard. It's built on the people you've used, discarded, and destroyed along the way. Richard's gaze hardened. The charm, the calm exterior, was slipping. For a moment, Emily saw the fear behind his eyes. He was scared. For the first time, he was scared of losing control. I never wanted any of this for you, Richard said, his voice softer now, but still carrying an edge. I did what I had to do to survive, Emily. You think you know what it takes to succeed, but you don't. You don't understand the price of power. Emily's anger flared, but she forced it down. I understand it perfectly, she said, her voice cold. I've seen the truth, Richard. I know what you did to my father. I know how far you'll go to protect yourself. Richard didn't respond. He knew she was right. His silence spoke volumes. The air between them crackled with tension. But just as Emily thought she had him cornered, something shifted. Vanessa entered the room, her sharp heels clicking against the marble floor. Her eyes flicked from Richard to Emily, and in that moment, Emily knew the game had changed. What's going on here? Vanessa asked, her voice tight with frustration. Richard, we need to talk. Now. Emily couldn't help but notice the way Vanessa's eyes lingered on Richard, a mix of anger and desperation in her gaze. It was clear that the cracks in their relationship were starting to show, and Emily wasn't sure who was more dangerous now, Richard or Vanessa. Richard looked at Vanessa, then back at Emily, his expression unreadable. This doesn't concern you, he said to Vanessa, his tone dismissive. Emily and I are having a private conversation. Vanessa's eyes narrowed. A private conversation about what? She demanded. About how Emily's been digging into your business. About how you've been lying to her this entire time. Emily's heart raced. Vanessa knew. But how much did she know? Vanessa, you don't understand, Richard said, his voice now tinged with frustration. This is about control. You have no idea what I've sacrificed to get here. And what about me? Vanessa shot back. What have I sacrificed, Richard? You think I've been content to stand by and watch you play this game? You think I haven't been part of your plan? The word stung, and Emily could see the resentment boiling over in Vanessa's eyes. It was clear now, Vanessa had her own agenda, and she wasn't willing to be sidelined anymore. Enough, Emily said, cutting through the tension. I've heard enough. You both think you can control everything, but you've underestimated me. I'm done with your games. I'm taking back what's mine. Richard and Vanessa both turned to her, and for a moment, it felt like the room was closing in. The storm outside raged on, and Emily knew that this was the beginning of the end. There was no going back now. Richard's eyes locked onto hers, his expression twisted with something between anger and fear. You'll regret this, Emily, he warned, his voice low. You don't know what you're up against. But Emily wasn't afraid anymore. No, she said, her voice firm. The question is, Richard, do you? With that, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving Richard and Vanessa standing in the ruins of their world. The final betrayal had begun, and there was no going back. Emily had made her move, and there was no turning back now. The truth was out, the cards were on the table, and Richard's empire was teetering on the edge of collapse. But now, as the dust settled, Emily felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. She had taken control of her life, and now, she would show Richard just how far she was willing to go. The days following her confrontation with Richard and Vanessa had been chaotic. Security measures around the mansion had tightened, and Richard's company had been in full damage control mode. Emily had taken a step back, biding her time, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The truth was out there, now she just had to expose it for the world to see. But she wasn't going to do it alone. Emily had spent days carefully piecing together the evidence of Richard's illegal dealings. It wasn't just about his manipulation of her, it was about how he had controlled and destroyed everyone in his path to build his empire. His past sins had come to light, and Emily knew that she had the power to bring him down, piece by piece. It wasn't going to be easy. Richard had his own way of spinning the truth, and Vanessa, despite her jealousy and resentment, was still a force to be reckoned with. But Emily had a trump card, her father's legacy, hidden away in the darkest corners of Richard's past. The time had come to shine a light on it. She met with Tom Harris, Richard's business rival, in a quiet cafe on the outskirts of the city. Tom was eager to help, though Emily wasn't sure she trusted him completely. He had his own agenda, but they both shared the same goal, to take down Richard. Tom slid a folder across the table to Emily. Here's everything you need, he said, his voice low. The financial records, the emails, the transactions, all of it. It's all in there. This is how Richard built his empire. Emily opened the folder, scanning through the documents with a sense of disbelief. The evidence was irrefutable. Richard's company had been involved in money laundering, illegal arms deals, and numerous other shady operations. It was all there in black and white. Emily's stomach turned as she realized the full extent of the monster she had been dealing with. "This is it," she said, her voice trembling with both anger and triumph. "This is how he did it." Tom nodded, his eyes dark. "And this is how we bring him down." But Emily knew that exposing Richard's crimes wouldn't be enough. Richard was too powerful, too well connected. He had the media in his pocket, and he had the resources to silence anyone who threatened his world. But Emily wasn't afraid of him anymore. She had something he couldn't control, the truth. And with that truth, she could turn the tide. She called a press conference. The media had been circling Richard's company like vultures, waiting for a crack in the armor. She knew they would be eager for a story, but she wasn't just going to hand them the truth. She was going to make them work for it. On the day of the press conference, Emily stood in front of the cameras, her heart pounding. The room was packed with reporters, their faces eager for the next big headline. Richard's company had already been in damage control for weeks, but Emily knew this would be the final blow. She cleared her throat and began. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice steady, "I'm here today to tell you the truth about Richard Cole. He's built his empire on lies, manipulation, and blood money. He's destroyed lives to protect his legacy. And I have the proof to prove it." The room went silent. Emily could see Richard's lawyers in the back, already shifting uncomfortably. He hadn't expected this. Not like this. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "I'm here to expose the truth, to show you how Richard Cole and his company have been involved in illegal activities, from money laundering to arms deals. My father's death was not an accident. Richard was behind it. He used my family, just as he's used so many others, to build his empire." The reporters' questions came flooding in, but Emily didn't flinch. She continued, revealing the evidence she had gathered, piece by piece. Every document, every transaction, every lie. It was all there, laid bare for the world to see. As the press conference ended, Emily felt a strange sense of satisfaction. The truth had been exposed, and there was no turning back. Richard's empire was crumbling, and she had done it. She had taken control of her fate. But as the reporters filed out of the room, Emily felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to see Vanessa standing behind her, a look of anger and disbelief on her face. "You think this is over?" Vanessa sneered. "You think you've won?" Emily's eyes locked onto Vanessa's, her voice calm and cold. "It's over when I say it's over." Vanessa stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "You're making a huge mistake. You think you've taken everything from Richard, but you've only just begun to scratch the surface. You have no idea what he's capable of." Emily didn't back down. She had come too far to be intimidated now. "No," she said, her voice low, "I know exactly what he's capable of. And that's why it's over." As Vanessa stormed off, Emily took a deep breath. The storm had passed. Richard's empire was on the verge of collapse, and she had done what she set out to do. But as she walked away from the press conference, she knew that the battle wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Richard might have been brought to his knees, but there were others like him, others who would stop at nothing to maintain their control. Emily had taken back her life, but the fight for justice was far from over. And now, she was ready for whatever came next. The city was alive with noise, the sound of honking horns, the rush of people moving through the streets, but inside the confines of the sleek, black SUV, everything felt eerily quiet. Emily stared out the window, the streets blurring past her, lost in the whirlwind of everything that had happened. Her pulse was still racing from the press conference. It had gone exactly as she planned. The truth was out, Richard was exposed, and his empire was crumbling. But something inside her told her this wasn't over. Not yet. Richard wouldn't go down without a fight. She had no doubt he'd already mobilized his resources, his lawyers, his PR team, anyone he could use to try to silence her. But it wasn't just about him anymore. Emily had something far more important on her side now. She had justice. She had the truth. And she wasn't about to let anyone take that from her. The car stopped in front of the grand building that housed Richard's headquarters. Her heart thudded in her chest. The doors of his empire were about to swing wide open, and there would be no place left for him to hide. She took a deep breath and stepped out of the vehicle, the sound of her heels on the pavement sharp in the air. Her hands were steady as she approached the entrance, her mind focused on the task ahead. She had one final confrontation to make. One last piece to complete the puzzle. Inside, Richard's office was as pristine and intimidating as always, the walls adorned with high-end artwork and corporate awards. But there was no longer the same air of invincibility that once radiated from the place. Richard's kingdom was no longer secure. Emily walked in without knocking, pushing the heavy door open with a force that made the hinges creak. Richard was standing by the window, staring out at the city below. He didn't turn when she entered. "I knew you'd come," he said, his voice calm, but there was something unsettling in the way his back was stiffened, the way he held himself. "I knew you couldn't leave it alone." Emily didn't speak at first. She just stood there, watching him, seeing the cracks in his facade. He wasn't the man who had once made her feel small, the man who had made promises that had destroyed lives. Now, he was just a man, standing in the ruins of his own making. "What's left, Richard?" Emily asked, her voice firm. "You've lost everything. Your empire, your secrets, your power, it's all falling apart. What more do you have?" Richard finally turned, his face taut with a mixture of frustration and something else, fear maybe. For the first time, he wasn't the one controlling the room. He was on the defensive. "You think you've won, don't you?" he said, his voice low, almost a growl. "But you're wrong. You have no idea what I've built, what I've sacrificed to get to where I am. You can't just take it all away. You think exposing me is going to change anything?" Emily stepped forward, her gaze never leaving his. "Yes. It will. And not just for you. It's about everyone you've hurt. Everyone you've trampled over to get here." Richard's lips curled into a bitter smile. "You think the world is going to care about your little crusade? Do you really think anyone's going to remember your father, or your petty little vendetta? People don't care about justice. They care about power." "I'm not here to change the world, Richard," Emily replied, her voice steady. "I'm here to take back what's mine. To take back what you stole from me and my family. You don't get to win anymore." Richard took a step forward, his eyes flashing with something dangerous. "You have no idea what you're up against. You think you've exposed me? You think you've won? I've built this empire, Emily. And I'll tear down anyone who tries to take it from me." For a moment, Emily hesitated. She could see the man in front of her, the man who had manipulated her, the man who had destroyed lives, and she wondered if she had made a mistake. But the hesitation didn't last long. "No, Richard," she said, shaking her head. "It's over. Your empire is crumbling. Your lies, your manipulation, they're finished. And you're the one who's going to pay for it." Richard's expression shifted, his jaw tightening as if he were about to say something else, but before he could speak, the door slammed open. Vanessa. Her face was twisted with anger and desperation. "You think you've won?" she spat, her eyes blazing. "You think this is over?" Emily turned to face her, surprised by the venom in Vanessa's voice. Vanessa stormed into the room, her heels clicking sharply on the polished floor. "You don't understand what you've done. You've made a terrible mistake." "I'm done listening to you," Emily said, her voice cutting through the tension. "You both think you can control me, but you're wrong." Vanessa's lips curled into a sneer. "You think you're the one in control? You don't know anything. You don't understand what Richard and I have built together." Emily took a deep breath, the weight of the moment settling in her chest. This wasn't just about Richard anymore. It was about everything they had done, everything they had taken from her and her family. "I understand enough," Emily said quietly. "And you won't get away with it. Not anymore." The room fell silent. The weight of the confrontation hung heavy in the air. Richard's empire was crumbling around him, and no amount of threats or lies could save him now. "You think you've won?" Vanessa repeated, her voice full of spite. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." But Emily didn't respond. She knew the truth now. She had everything she needed. And she wasn't going to let either of them get away with what they had done. As she turned to leave, Richard's voice called after her, soft but cutting. "You won't make it out of here alive, Emily." She didn't stop. She didn't even look back. The final confrontation was over. But as Emily walked out of Richard's office, she knew this was only the beginning. The battle for justice wasn't over. But now, she had everything she needed to see it through to the end.